This is Chad Bunger, Assistant Director of the Community Development Department for the City of Manhattan. I'd like to discuss non-conformities as part of the Manhattan Development Code video series. Non-conformities of the zoning regulations can be a bit confusing and a complicated topic. As a starting point, it never hurts to review the purpose of zoning, as these statements are usually the underlying reason why the zoning districts or rules change, creating situations where a property or building does not conform to the current rules. In general, a use, building, lot, or site improvement that does not comply with the current zoning regulations are either legally non-conforming or they are illegal. Most typically, a non-conforming use, such as an existing apartment building in an area currently zoned for single-family homes, is the most frequent issue that staff handles. However, a building that encroaches into a setback is also a regularly occurring situation. The standard approach to handling non-conforming situations is through attrition, where a use goes away or the building is redeveloped at some point. Manhattan's current regulations for non-conforming uses must meet three criteria. Was it lawfully created? Has it continually been used in that same way? And is the only reason it's non-conforming is because of the change of the regulations. If it does not meet these criteria, then it would be considered illegal and should be addressed through enforcement. I find it easier to use examples to explain these set of regulations. So, in this area, east of City Park, it has had quite the zoning history. As you can see, when zoning regulations were first established in 1925, properties in this area were zoned to allow for 1- and 2-family dwellings. When the adoption of the regulations back in 1925, any use that was not a single-family home or 2-family dwelling was automatically a legal non-conforming use, since there is no zoning regulations to follow before that. Then in 1940, the rules changed to allow for apartments also in this area. In 1970, with the adoption of a completely new set of zoning regulations, the district name changed, but is still allowed for apartments. Then in 1987, you could only have 1, 2, 3, or 4 dwellings on a lot. In 2004, the city adopted a set of design regulations to limit the use and create some site and building design requirements to ensure that these areas remained as a traditional looking neighborhood. Finally, in 2015, the neighborhood was downzoned to the R1 T&O district, which limits the use to single-family homes. This was done after the community agreed through the comprehensive plan process that the area should be downzoned to allow for low-density residential uses. If you're familiar with this area, you know that it has some medium-sized apartment buildings, homes converted into multiple dwellings, duplexes, and single-family homes, all of which were most likely conforming to the zoning regulations at some point. So let's look at a specific example that is completely made up. Let's say we have a building located in this neighborhood east of City Park, and it has 4 separate dwelling units in it today. The home was built in 1925 as a single-family dwelling. Then in 1971, after the zoning regulations changed, it was remodeled to have 4 separate apartments in it. To determine if it was legally non-conforming, we need to address those 3 criteria. Based on the simple review of the zoning history, it appears it could have had 4 dwellings. In 2015, the area was downzoned to its R1 T&O district, and that is the point in which the property became non-compliant to the zoning regulations. We then have to make sure any building additions, parking lot designs, etc. conformed at the time it was converted, and has generally been in that same condition. That's over 70 years worth of time to try to figure out if it was lawfully established and remained in the same general condition. To figure this all out, the property owner and city planners look through all sorts of public and private information as it's available. If the city can give an opinion of legal non-conforming use, then the use can exist. In this case, as a residential use, it can be rebuilt even if it's completely destroyed by any act of God. For non-residential uses, the legal non-conforming use can only be repaired if the use is damaged to 50% or less of its fair market value. If the use is found to be illegal, generally meaning that the use was established against some zoning regulation, such as the fourplex was not built between 1969 and 2015, then the city would need to enforce the situation. Generally speaking, the city tries to gain compliance voluntarily by informing the property owner and working to have the legal issues removed or addressed. But if that doesn't happen voluntarily, the city will take legal actions through the court systems. The current regulations can be confusing and challenging to navigate as a property owner of a non-conforming use, as well as the people lending them money to own that property. It can also be confusing to the neighbors because of the uncertainty of that use and the potential harmful impacts that it may bring to the neighborhood. Investors of competing property that do conform to the zoning regulations, such as an apartment owner in another area of town that's properly zoned, may see the nonconformity as an issue. Also, the tenants of this nonconforming use may also be concerned because of the uncertainty of the property they live at or work at. Also, for staff, this current process is also very challenging to administer. In my nearly 15 years of working for the city of Manhattan as a planner, I can say I've never dealt with an easy, slam-dunk, non-conforming use issue. So because of all this, city staff is proposing an overhaul of the regulations that govern non-conforming uses, structures, lots, and site improvements. First, we created these guiding policies to help us better explain how the city wanted to administer this type of regulation. We want to allow these uses and structures and lots to exist and be maintained in a safe, comfortable condition, but bring as many into conformance as possible, and also to limit the reestablishment of abandoned or substantially damaged nonconformities. We want to encourage redevelopment of these non-conforming uses that will decrease the degree of nonconformity. And if we discover an illegal use, appropriate enforcement will be applied to create a fair system. To do this, we had to make some significant changes that we proposed with the development code. We will uncouple the use from the structure. Today we look at the use, setbacks of the building, building height, lot coverage, parking lot, and screening. For older properties, we sometimes don't have a building permit or site plan for the structure or subsequent additions. Additionally, there are no notes on how the regulations were administered. So staff had to make a number of judgment calls on how a building and a use came to be. This makes it extremely challenging to determine if the use was legal at some point in the past. By removing the building and site improvements from the equation of if a use is non-conforming, we'll drill down to the most important question. Was the use legal at some time, and has it remained in the same general condition until the regulations changed, causing the nonconformity? Separating the use from the building also recognizes that the building is now part of the neighborhood fabric, and asking a property owner to correct a setback issue, for example, is nearly impossible. From a property owner perspective, we've heard that banks are reluctant to lend money for a non-conforming use, and they need documentation from the city about that use and the application of the regulations. Going through a registration process should alleviate that issue. It will be able to provide the documentation to whoever needs it that the properties are non-conforming, explain the regulations, and then give staff a better understanding of how to administer the regulations for maintenance and life safety improvements. The one significant change is reinstating the threshold for substantial damage. I mentioned earlier that today a non-conforming residential use could be completely destroyed and the regulations would allow the owner to build back as it was. This rule was established in 2003 to appease some owners during a significant zoning regulation change with the traditional overlay district was created. Manhattan is the only community in the state that allows this. All other communities require that if a structure is damaged beyond 50% of the fair market value of the home, it must be brought into conformance. In reality, the current regulations act as a mini spot zoning for these non-conforming residential uses. We understand that this is a change that will impact property owners. However, the current regulations do not allow the city to realize the community's vision that the district or regulation changes were designed to achieve. City hopes that the new rules, allowing for greater flexibility for non-conforming uses to be maintained, repaired, remodeled, and even have the use changed, will be a good compromise. As an example, today, if an owner of a non-conforming use wants to add an egress window for safety, this requires a building permit, and then a conditional use needs to be approved by the Board of Zoning Appeals for the change. The proposed regulations would allow the building permit to be issued administratively to address the life safety issues to keep the tenants safe, which is ultimately what the city wants out of these kind of regulations. So here's a summary of what I just mentioned regarding the registration and how the use is going to be decoupled from the building requirements, and the rights approved if the property is registered as a non-conforming use. So looking back at our 4-family unit, was it lawfully established in the same condition continuously up until the regulations change? But we will only focus on the use, not the structure. And so here, knowing that the use was established in 1971, we can be fairly certain that it would be non-conforming, and then the regulations would apply to maintain it and remodel it, etc. Okay, from here I want to switch to non-conforming structures, as well as lots and site improvements quickly. Non-conforming buildings would generally be buildings that cannot meet the required building setback, lot coverage, or height requirement. For some of the older areas of town, this may be because the building was constructed before Manhattan adopted zoning regulations back in 1925. At any rate, these buildings have become part of the built environment and would be nearly impossible for the city to ask a property owner to move a home or garage. This, however, does not mean that the city will not enforce a building where there is evidence that it was knowingly built illegally, especially a relatively new building or a building addition. The proposed regulations would not require a non-conforming structure to be registered, and it can be maintained, remodeled, and even added onto as long as the degree of non-conformity is not increased. If a building is damaged beyond 50% of the fair market value, then the repair or rebuilt structure must conform to the zoning regulations. So, as an example, here we have a property owner proposing a building addition onto the house. Although the house encroaches into that setback along the front yard of South 12th Street, the new building addition would be located behind that setback line, so it would be able to be constructed with the required permits. But this detached garage example here, the addition would encroach into the setback, so would not be allowed unless it was redesigned to be behind the setback line or approved by the Board of Zoning Appeals. Similarly, non-conforming lots will be allowed to exist without needing to register. New structures and additions can be built as long as they meet the requirements of the district. For very small or narrow lots, this section of the regulations has standards to establish appropriate setbacks in these unique conditions. For site improvements like dumpster screening, landscaping, and parking lot pavement requirements, they're typically easier to bring into conformance. So when a building is expanded, the building goes through an extensive remodel that is beyond 50% of its fair market value, or a more intense non-residential use goes into a building, these non-conforming site improvements must be addressed. Lastly, the question of when a non-conforming use becomes abandoned and thus losing its rights offered in the regulations is often asked and can be a challenging question. The current standards are a bit confusing, so staff took this opportunity to rework the regulations, as you can see here, to make them easier to understand and apply. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, non-conforming uses are extremely complicated and challenging. City staff hopes these proposed regulations balance the needs of the owners of a non-conformity, the surrounding neighborhood, and the goals of the community. If you have any questions about this set of regulations or other parts of the proposed Manhattan Development Code, please feel free to contact us at the Community Development Department. Also, come back to the project page at engagemhk.org to learn more about the Manhattan Development Code and get updates on the adoption process. Thanks for watching. Really appreciate it.